The agenda this week assessed the state of the war in Ukraine, debated bike lanes in the provincial capital, and asked if what are considered the usual life milestones need to be updated. The agenda's week in review begins considering the problem of interference by foreign states in Canadian elections.
I was surprised by the fact that Mr. Johnson didn't hold a public inquiry, as Laura was referring to there, but I was also really surprised, and maybe it's my naive optimism. I was surprised when the two opposition leaders, turned down the chance to read what was in the documents and calling it a trap. And, as I said before, how low this went. I'm trying to imagine another G7 country where a legislator turns down a chance to read a top secret national security report on a matter that has been before Parliament for the last few months. I think that tells us where this debate is and where our politics are, but I still was quite surprised. The idea that they would be silenced by this, people have had some fun with it too, are these opposition leaders never going to go into a cabinet meeting because they can't talk about it after, or they never have a caucus meeting? This is all politics is not done in the open, and I do confess to some surprise at that.
Well, Richard Fadden, let's take them at their word when they said, how are we supposed to ask difficult, tough questions of the government if we have been sworn in and kind of taken into the government's confidence? We're sort of hamstrung to do that job if that happens. What do you think of that argument?
I think it's overstating the constraints under which they're operating. Yes, they cannot refer to particular intelligence that they may have seen, but it will give them an indication as to whether or not broader questioning is going up the right path or not. I had access to a lot of highly classified information throughout my career, and I appeared before Parliament and on a number of occasions. And what I tried to do was to aggregate up what I knew and still try and answer their questions. So I think they're overstating the constraints they operate under. I wonder if I could make another general point. I think this is illustrative of another much more serious problem Parliament has. Parliamentarians in Canada fundamentally have no access to classified information. You take MPs, they become ministers, and they're instantaneously expected to be experts in national security and highly secure material. Our British and Australian friends have found a way to give not total access, but much, much more access to Parliament. Mr. Trudeau's offer, I think, was genuine at one level, but probably was motivated to some extent by political expediency. But I think as part of this broad exercise, we should also give some thought to finding ways to give parliamentarians regular, ongoing access to classified information. Not as much as the U.S. Congress, because they have a different system, but perhaps as much as the Brit and the Australians have.
Laura, I gather they don't do that because they don't think that opposition backbenchers can keep a secret, or that they're worried that loose lips will sink ships. Is that a reasonable concern?
Well, I don't know all the nuances behind these decisions, but I think the fact that we've had these leaks right now would suggest that some of the concerns might be somewhat founded. I mean, I'm with Susan. I was surprised that they didn't, take up the offer to be able to look at these documents. And it just speaks to this culture of not working together, I guess, like just so highly partisan that it's, this is a really big concern that we should be dealing with at the parliamentary level as a nation. And instead, what we're seeing is concerns about who gets to say what when. And I'm a little worried that we're going to be losing sight of the bigger picture because we're worried about leaks or worried about who's saying this or who's saying that, rather than trying to actually, work to protect the integrity of our democracy.
Well, I'm going to take your advice and move on to the bigger picture here. And I guess, the bigger picture here is not just this government, but Canadian governments in general. Are they as attentive to matters of national security and protecting our democracy from foreign interference as they should be? Akash, you've been watching the national scene for a couple of decades. How does it look to you?
They are absolutely not sufficiently attentive to these issues. One of the conclusions of Johnson's initial report was that information was being provided to the PMO and to Cabinet, but it wasn't being read because it was being provided in a format or in a way that political staffers and ministers themselves found to be difficult, impenetrable, or onerous. I don't think that that exonerates them in any way, shape, or form, because ultimately this is their system. If the system was such that they did not feel they were able to get a grasp on what they were being told by the security services, it was their responsibilities to fix that, and to fix it before it became a matter of controversy. Yes, there are black binders that are full of undifferentiated information. You have to do your homework. If you're in high school, you should have to do your homework if you're in cabinet. And if the nature of that information being relayed to you is again impenetrable, you have the power that is necessary to ask for that information in an alternative form. I think we also have to bear in mind that foreign interference in democratic elections is not the exception, it is the rule. Of about 200 countries in the international system, perhaps as few as 25 of them are full democracies. That means that the vast majority of countries in the international system are non-democratic and are hostile to democracies. It is in their interest, not just in China, but in every other totalitarian state, to make the case that democracies cannot succeed, democracies will always fail, and to project their power into democracies in an attempt to do that. We have to bear in mind, as one of the few democracies in the world, that we will always be beset by an ocean of enemies of democracy, and we have to take that seriously. I see no evidence that is being taken seriously.
Well, having said that, and Richard Fadden, I'll go to you on this, no known interference from China, says the report. You buying that?
No, absolutely not. I think that's dead wrong. Can I back up a little bit and try and explain why I think this government and previous governments don't spend enough time on national security?
Sure.
We don't feel particularly threatened in Canada. We have 3 oceans and we have the United States. So as a country, we don't worry a lot about national security and we don't think a lot about it. During the course of the last 2 federal elections, the issue, foreign defense and security policy, did not come up once. I think that's wrong because there are real threats against Canada, both the terrorist side, foreign interference. Foreign espionage is now worse than it was during the height of the Cold War. We don't have a national security culture like all of our allies do, and I don't quite know what to do about it except to expect our national leaders to talk about this more in a reasonable manner. But until they see votes in national security, with the exception of real crises, I think when there are real crises, we do respond fairly well as a country. But until there are votes in national security, politicians are going to pay more attention to economic or social policy.
The reason this counteroffensive matters so much, I don't think we should look at it only in terms of the amount of territory that Ukraine can take back.
How else should we look at it?
How many Russian troops are left standing at the end of this? Because then Vladimir Putin will be confronted with a very tough decision. Does he order a second wave of mobilization? And there are interesting polls in Russia about Russian support. You know, all of us would admit it's really hard to do good public opinion sampling, but the more independent pollsters in Moscow, what they're showing is what we would call thin support. They're not showing opposition, but the support is thin. And another large mobilization of the kind that Putin was forced to do last September is not something I suspect that he wants to do.
Andrew, let's pick up the story with the spring offensive, so-called, that Ukraine is apparently planning. Again, no one knows for sure, but if you were a general looking at the battlefield, how would you see that playing out over the next several weeks and or months?
Well, from the Ukrainian point of view, their weakest spot is people power. The West can supply them weapons, and they are supplying all the weapons the Ukraine more or less needs. However, they are not going to supply people, and because NATO is not going to go to war with Russia. So the Ukrainians have a diminishing pool of people that they can put into the fight. And this upcoming offensive, this is a deliberate offensive being planned by Ukraine against a deliberate Russian defense. And we have not seen this in the war as yet, where both sides are fully prepared, fully determined, and casualties should be expected to be quite high. The Russians are fortified. So if you're a Ukrainian general, you're looking at this, how do I attack, minimizing my casualties At the same time, knowing that I will not achieve the strategic objective of Ukraine, which is to push the Russians back to the 1991 borders, including Crimea. Now, that puts Ukraine into an everlasting war, almost a war, a renewed offensive in the fall, perhaps, after suffering significant casualties and pressure from the West and others that maybe it's time to look at a ceasefire, which the Ukrainians desperately do not want to look at a ceasefire. So alternatively, Ukrainians might be looking at new ways of attacking, not a large-scale offensive, but small probing offensives that bite away at the Russian lines without the Ukrainians sustaining heavy casualties. The drone attacks, these attacks in Belgorod and so on, are part of wearing down the Russians. So that could be a new innovative way that the Ukrainians are doing, because in a classic way, they're going to hit the Russian line, try to punch through, threaten Crimea in your Kherson, and sustain heavy casualties and be forced to examine a prospect of a ceasefire or keep fighting in 2024.
Jeff, can you pick up on that? How do you see a potential spring offensive playing out?
Yeah, I would agree with Andrew completely on this. And for all the losses of manpower that Russia has had, Ukraine suffers more when it's 1-to-1 or even 2-to-1 situations. And of course, once you have an offensive, the offensive forces confronting forces dug in are generally expected to lose more in terms of human casualties. So I think this is why we have seen continued delay in the offensive, this managing of expectations that Janice mentioned, this effort to have these missile strikes around Belgorod, potentially in Moscow. And just as Moscow is itself hitting Kiev with missiles trying to wear down the Ukrainian defenses and trying to wear down Ukrainian anti-aircraft, trying to force them to defend a broader scope of territory as well. So we're going to see moves and counter moves in the next 2 months, more like Andrew described, rather than one of these massive offensives that we saw in the fall, where Ukraine was able to punch through the Russian lines because the fortifications are just too tight right now, and Ukraine has to watch every man so carefully.
Yeah, Erica, maybe you could pick up on that in as much as if there's an understanding in Ukraine that a sort of typical massive spring offensive isn't going to achieve the strategic objectives that one would expect. I don't mean this question to sound naive, but is there any point in doing it then?
Well, I mean, I think if I was a Ukrainian general, I would be very concerned about the coming winter, because Russian tanks are more maneuverable in the winter. And so I'd be wanting this counteroffensive to succeed. But at the same time, I think it's very true to say that this is really an international campaign where Zelensky has to travel internationally and try to get support. And so they need to sound as if they're going to have a success. And frankly, whatever happens can be interpreted as a success by the West. And that's the problem, is we will never actually really know, just like in Afghanistan, where we were constantly told that, oh, the Afghan National Security Forces have captured 51% of the country, yeah. In the end, we found out, no. So what I'm saying is, it's kind of the media. It's kind of a situation where we in the West want them to win, but we won't really ever know. And this war could drag on for years and years. The only thing I think that could happen would be that Putin dies. He's in a cocoon. He's not seeing anyone. They have to wait for a week to see him. Maybe if he dies or he retires early somehow, then that might change how we get to the table. But we've got to get to the table. And so I don't think the number of deaths is important. It's what Putin does. I'd like to hear what Janice thinks about that.
Okay, we're going to find that out right now.
I'm agreeing with everybody here that this offensive, however it unfolds, and I tend to think it will be, and they're telegraphing this, the Ukrainians are, it'll be a series of smaller ones rather than roll the dice on one big one. You know, when the Ukrainians broke through last year, and it's very important that people understand that in the West, the Russians had not had time to do what they've done now, which is to prepare, dig in, and fortify. So it's going to be much, much more expensive in lives and casualties. So I think the Ukrainians are well aware of that. Where I'm less optimistic a little bit than Erica is about the timing of getting to the table.
Paul, get us started here. The traditional deadline for life's milestones typically tend to be between the ages of 20 and 30. Can you give us some sense about how these expectations originated to begin with?
Well, I think that these timelines originated based on the sort of social practices of the day. You know, when people were coupling up, when people were completing school, when people landed a job, when did they get their secure housing, and those established norms over time. And I think this conversation is bubbling up right now because the norms of the past few decades, especially when baby boomers started out, they are not today's norms. And they're not today's norms because hard work isn't paying off for a younger demographic as it's starting into its adult years. And as a result, it's causing a range of delays in milestones that some decades ago we thought had become the norm.
Well, let me follow up with Tony on that. Do you think the young people, for example, that you engage with at your university, do you think they judge themselves and their circumstances by their parents' milestone expectations?
Well, Steve, I think that the milestone expectations go beyond their parents. They're getting reinforced in society, even through their friends and extended networks. So the pressure that students are feeling is real. They're very focused on, I need to get a good job, I need to be financially stable. They're thinking about the potential of coupling up, the potential of having kids and not having kids. So they're really grappling with, you know, what do I do next? And what does it mean to be an adult? And what does it mean to be me?
They are thinking about all this at ages 18, 19, 20?
Oh, absolutely.
Really?
Absolutely.
Is that healthy?
I don't know if I would say it's healthy or not healthy, but these are the concerns of emerging adulthood, though, and that's the stage of life that they're in.
Dave, let me get you in here because we've invited you here because you wrote a piece in the Globe and Mail about the end of your marriage, which I got to say was extremely a beautiful piece and quite heartbreaking all at the same time. And you said in that piece, the entire future I had taken for granted was suddenly gone. I wonder how all of that contributed to a sense of derailment in your life, that the milestones that you had expected to live by were suddenly all askew.
Oh, sure. Everything's just a blank page now, right? I mean, I think your big milestones from 20 to 30, like you said, are, you know, graduate school, find a good paying job, get married, have kids, find a house, right? Let's say those are the big ones. But from 40 on, you know, I was living in the house that I thought I was going to die in. I expected retirement and a plan, not even a plan, an assumed life had just suddenly vanished in the aftermath of my divorce, right? Now you have to, where am I going to live? How are we going to share the kids? What is my retirement going to look like? What is my entire life going to look like? And that uncertainty, it's a scary thing to face.
Was there any satisfaction in knowing that once you went public with your circumstances, you had a whole bunch of friends who said, oh, guess what? I feel your pain, brother. I've been there too.
Everyone. So many phone calls, so many emails. And it goes back to the point of the story, which is how much men are reluctant often to talk about what's going on in their own lives. But certainly it's comforting to have friends come out of the woodwork and say, hey, me too. There was even a period where, you know, I'm looking for housing in Toronto because I want to be here still in the city and maintain a certain continuity for my kids' lives. And me and another divorced dad were only half jokingly talking about living in an 80s sitcom where we would buy a house together and he'd have his kids the week that I didn't, and, you know, vice versa, because that's just how sort of difficult that transition could be in this brave new world where none of the milestones you think are easy are easy anymore.
How close did that come to actually happening?
Too close for comfort.
Okay, good. Paul, why don't you come in here and tell us, again, you deal with young people, obviously, in the course of your day with your university responsibilities and with your Think and Change tank. How much are today's young people, do you think, still influenced by the sort of old-fashioned strictures that were just outlined by our guests here?
Well, it remains a part of the cultural context by which people judge whether or not they're being successful. I mean, one thing that Gen Squeeze had to do in our early days was help a younger demographic as they're starting into their adult years recognize that if they're struggling to establish a financial foundation, that's not because they're necessarily doing something individually wrong. It's because the way in which the economy and society's evolved has made their hard work pay off less, and we haven't used public policy to adapt all that urgently for them.
You say you're not against bike lanes. but you may have a different view on how well we're doing. What's your take?
Well, listen, we set up Keep Toronto Moving, Steve, not because we're against bike lanes at all, but we just feel that they're not being put in the right places. The reality is, if you look to the 2011, the 2016, and the 2021 census, we have about 1.5% to 2% of identified commuters through the census advising us that they use bike lanes to get to work and back. And so why we're putting bike lanes on some of the busiest streets in the city, like Yonge Street, like the Danforth, like Bloor Street, makes, to me, no sense. It's not good for cyclists, because why would you want to put cyclists on the busiest streets when there are alternative streets that cyclists could use much more safely?
Alison, you want to speak to that?
I sure do. So like people who drive their cars, the reason that there needs to be more bike lanes on busy streets is because those are where all the locations and destinations are. So what we found, for example, during COVID, one of the reasons why the city implemented active TO, it was to provide alternative, safe transportation options for essential workers, many healthcare professionals. So for example, one of the reasons that the university bike lanes were implemented was at the request of doctors and health professionals that needed that safe way to get to it. And so whereas the success of our car infrastructure, it hinges on the fact that it's interconnected and across the city. And so just as we did when we built our system of automobility and built our roads and streets, we now need to add additional lanes for bikes to make it safer for people walking, taking transit, and biking.
Let me put that to Eleanor McMahon. Eleanor, you heard Trevor say that only 1.5 to 2% of people who are commuting are using bike lanes, and there's a lot of infrastructure going in to accommodate a relatively small slice of the commuting public. What's your view on that?
Two things, Steve. It's chicken and egg. If you build it, they will come. So basing our urban planning around current measures is not visionary, and it's not good city building and city planning. It's also not accommodating what people want. I have another survey to put in the window, and it's one that we did at the Share the Road Cycling Coalition, aligned with our Ontario Bike Summit earlier this year, in fact, just in April. And we did a study, and we did a poll of Ontarians, and a couple of important things emerged. First of all, over the last 10 years, the number of people riding daily has gone up 5-fold. So now 22% of Ontarians are daily cyclists. That's close to 4 million people who are riding their bike every day, over 3 million people. And that's extraordinary. And those people want and need safe spaces to ride. I think as a society, we have an obligation to find ways for them to ride, to go to places that they want. And it's in our absolute interest to do that, because the bicycle that's beside you, or in front of you in some cases, ideally beside you, in a protected infrastructure and bike lane, is the car that isn't. And more people getting out of their cars more often enhances affordability, enhances people's well-being, enhances economic activity, actually. And if we can find safe and smart ways to do it, as cities around the world are doing. I just got back from the Global Cycling Conference, Velocity in Germany. So I guess I'm inspired by cities all around the world that are doing exactly what Canada is trying to do, and we are making some progress, but more needs to be done. And I would say that since 40% of our trips in Canada are under 10 kilometers, and indeed 30% of them are under 2 kilometers, most of our daily trips are doable by bicycle, and we can start to think of converting those trips and making infrastructure a primary way to invest in, so that we can engineer that.
That's just some of what we covered this week. You can find more, including the full conversations, on our website, TVO.org, our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda, or our Twitter feed, twitter.com/theagenda.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.